Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into the American Civil War today.
A fascinating period of history, to say the least.
Definitely. And we're using a really interesting YouTube documentary as our guide this time.
A Guerra Civil Americana.
That's the one.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, I learned a lot from it. Some things I never knew.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, did you know that a simple invention like the cotton gin played a huge role in starting the war?
I see where you're going with that. Yeah, the cotton gin revolutionized cotton production, made it way more profitable. But it also increased the South's dependence on slave labor.
It's incredible how technology can have such unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And that's just one example of how the Civil War wasn't just some sudden explosion. It was a slow burn. Decades of tension bubbling under the surface.
A boiling pot ready to spill over. So, what were the main ingredients in this recipe for disaster?
Well, slavery was the biggest one, obviously. It was at the heart of the South's economy and culture.
Right. But the North had mostly moved away from slavery by then.
Exactly. Their economy was more industrialized, reliant on immigrant labor, and there was a growing abolitionist movement in the North calling for an end to slavery altogether. The South saw this as a direct threat to their way of life.
So you had these two completely different societies trying to coexist within the same nation.
And as the U.S. expanded westward, the tension only grew. Every new territory brought up the same question. Would it be a slave state or a free state?
Like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. And speaking of adding fuel, let's talk about the cotton gin for a moment.
Okay, back to the cotton gin. How did that seemingly simple invention contribute to the conflict?
Well, before the cotton gin, processing cotton was very labor-intensive. But Eli Whitney's invention in 1793 changed everything. It made separating the seeds from the cotton much faster and more efficient.
So cotton production skyrocketed.
Exactly. And that meant a huge increase in demand for slave labor to plant, harvest, and process all that cotton. The South became even more reliant on slavery, and the profits from cotton made the Southern elite very wealthy and powerful.
And they were determined to protect that wealth and power, even if it meant going to war.
You got it. And it's important to remember that westward expansion was happening at the same time as all this. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the U.S., opening up vast new territories.
More land, more potential for conflict over slavery.
Precisely. Each new territory was a battleground, with both sides vying for control. And the documentary highlighted how these compromises, like the Missouri Compromise in 1820, were just temporary solutions.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
A very good analogy. The Missouri Compromise tried to maintain a balance between slave states and free states. It drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase, allowing slavery below the line, but prohibiting it above.
Did that actually solve anything?
It kicked the can down the road, you could say, bought them some time, but the fundamental conflict remained. And then you had the Compromise of 1850.
Which included the Fugitive Slave Act, right?
Yep, that was a big one. It required people in free states to help capture and return runaway slaves. It was deeply unpopular in the North.
I can imagine. It basically forced people to participate in a system they found morally reprehensible.
Exactly. And then things got even messier with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854.
That one really stirred the pot, didn't it?
It sure did. It tried to use the idea of popular sovereignty, letting the people in the Kansas and Nebraska territories vote on whether to allow slavery.
Sounds democratic in theory.
It was anything but. It led to widespread violence and fraud as both sides tried to influence the vote. Bleeding Kansas, they called it. Not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony.
So instead of cooling things down, these compromises seem to just make things worse.
They exposed the growing chasm between North and South, that's for sure. Made it clear that this issue of slavery was not going away quietly. And then onto this already volatile scene walks a man named Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln.
Yeah.
The documentary did a great job of showing him as a real person, not just the larger-than-life figure we see on monuments.
Yeah, it was interesting to learn about his humble beginnings, his rise to prominence, and how his views on slavery evolved over time.
I was surprised to learn he wasn't initially for immediate abolition.
Right. His main focus was on preserving the Union. But for many in the South, his election in 1860 was the final straw.
Even though he wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states.
Exactly. He didn't receive a single electoral vote from the South, and yet he became president. To many Southerners, it felt like their voice was being completely ignored.
Talk about feeling alienated.
And within months of his election, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Other Southern states quickly followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America.
So, even though Lincoln tried to reassure the South that he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it already existed, The damage was done.
Pretty much. The wheels of war were already in motion, and then came Fort Sumter.
That was the spark that ignited the powder keg, wasn't it?
In April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, marking the official start of the Civil War. It was a symbolic act, a declaration that they were willing to fight for their way of life, even if it meant tearing the nation apart.
And from that moment on, there was no turning back.
4 long and bloody years of conflict lay ahead.
We've talked about their differences, but what were the strengths and weaknesses of each side going into this war?
Well, on the surface, the Union, the North, had some clear advantages. A much larger population, for starters.
War soldiers for the army.
Exactly. And they had a booming industrial economy, factories churning out weapons and supplies, plus a vast network of railroads to transport troops and resources.
So they had the manpower, the factories, and the infrastructure. Sounds like a winning combination.
It certainly did. But the Confederacy, the South, had their own advantages. Their soldiers were highly motivated, fighting to defend their homes and way of life. They also had some brilliant military leaders.
Like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson.
Yeah.
The documentary mentioned them.
Yeah, they were brilliant strategists, capable of pulling off surprising victories despite being outnumbered and outgunned. So it wasn't a clear-cut case of one side having an overwhelming advantage.
It's fascinating how both sides brought unique strengths and weaknesses to the battlefield. It makes you wonder how the war might have unfolded differently if those factors had been reversed.
That's a question historians still debate today. The Civil War was a complex conflict, a clash of ideologies, cultures, and economies. It's not a simple story of good versus evil.
And it's a conflict whose legacy still shapes American society today. But before we explore that legacy, let's dive into the heart of this conflict, the battles themselves. What were some of those early clashes that set the stage for the long and bloody struggle ahead?
Well, after Fort Sumter, both sides scrambled to mobilize their forces. And the first major clash, the First Battle of Bull Run, happened in July 1861. It was a chaotic mess.
What made Bull Run so chaotic?
Well, for starters, both sides were still pretty inexperienced, and the battle itself was poorly organized.
So a lot of confusion and miscommunication on both sides.
You could say that. And the result was a bloody stalemate that shocked both North and South. The Union had gone into it expecting a quick victory, but the Confederates put up a fierce fight and ended up winning the day.
So it shattered the illusion of a quick and easy war.
Absolutely. Bull Run was a wake-up call for both sides. It showed them that this conflict was going to be long, bloody, and unpredictable.
A brutal reality check. Did this Confederate victory at Bull Run have any lasting strategic impact?
It definitely boosted Confederate morale, and it gave them valuable combat experience. For the Union, it was a humbling experience, forcing them to reevaluate their strategy and prepare for a much longer and more difficult war.
So Bull Run was a turning point, in a way, setting the stage for the brutal years to come. What other early battles shaped the war's trajectory?
Well, in the West, the Union had a series of victories in early 1862. They captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February, which gave them control of crucial waterways.
Rivers were like the highways back then, weren't they?
Exactly. Controlling the rivers meant controlling the movement of troops and supplies. And then, in April, they won the Battle of Shiloh.
Shiloh, that was a bloody one, wasn't it?
One of the bloodiest of the entire war. Heavy casualties on both sides. But it was a strategic victory for the Union, further solidifying their control of the Western theater.
It's hard to imagine the scale of the losses on both sides, even in those early battles. Were there any other early clashes that significantly impacted the war?
One that stands out is the naval battle between the ironclads.
Ironclads, those sound pretty intense. What were they?
They were warships covered in iron armor, basically floating fortresses.
Sounds like a clash of titans.
It was. In March of 1862, the USS Monitor, a Union ironclad, faced off against the CSS Virginia, a Confederate ironclad.
What was the outcome?
The battle itself was a draw. Neither ship could sink the other. But it marked a turning point in naval warfare. The age of wooden warships was over. The ironclads had arrived.
So the Civil War spurred this leap in naval technology.
It was like an arms race at sea. And on land, the war was about to enter a new phase, one that would change the very nature of the conflict.
What do you mean?
In January of 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
The Emancipation Proclamation, a pivotal moment.
It declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. It transformed the war from a conflict over preserving the Union into a fight for freedom.
It reframed the entire moral landscape of the war, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it had a profound impact on both sides, as well as on international opinion.
It's incredible how this single document could have such a far-reaching impact.
It was a bold move by Lincoln, a gamble that ultimately paid off. And it paved the way for African Americans to officially join the Union Army, fighting for their own liberation.
Speaking of turning points, that brings us to Gettysburg,
Yeah.
arguably the most famous battle of the Civil War. What made Gettysburg so significant?
Gettysburg was a culmination of many factors. In the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to take the war north. He was emboldened by some recent victories and hoped to score a decisive win on Union soil.
So a bold move by Lee, taking the fight to the enemy's heartland.
Exactly. But it was a risky gamble and it backfired. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought over 3 bloody days in July of 1863, ended in a Union victory.
And this victory was a major turning point in the war.
It was. Lee's army suffered heavy losses, and the South's best chance for a decisive win in the East was gone. From that point on, the Confederacy was on the defensive.
The tide was turning. But at what cost? The documentary really drove home the human toll of this conflict. Can you talk a little about that?
We're talking over 620,000 soldiers dead, countless others wounded, families torn apart, communities devastated. The human cost of the Civil War is almost impossible to comprehend.
It's a sobering reminder that war leaves scars that run far deeper than any battlefield wound.
It's a lesson we must never forget. The human cost of conflict, the ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate fighting, are immeasurable.
Absolutely. And with that solemn reminder, let's continue exploring the Civil War. What happened after those crucial Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg? Where did the conflict shift next?
Well, while the East was focused on Gettysburg, the West witnessed a pivotal moment of its own: the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi, in July of 1863.
Vicksburg. Why was that city so important?
It was a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Controlling Vicksburg meant controlling this vital waterway, and the Union had been trying to capture it for months.
So the Union was squeezing the Confederacy from both sides.
Precisely. The capture of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two, cutting off crucial supply lines. These simultaneous victories in the East and West marked a decisive turning point, signaling that the tide had truly turned in favor of the Union.
It's remarkable how these two geographically distant victories, happening almost at the same time, effectively sealed the fate of the Confederacy.
It really highlights the strategic complexity of the war. While individual battles were important, the overall campaign involved a delicate interplay of political, economic, and military factors across vast distances.
It's like a giant chessboard, with each move influencing the entire game.
That's a great analogy. And in this chess game, the Union was starting to gain a decisive advantage. But the war was far from over.
So the stage is set for the final act of this epic drama. But before we explore those final campaigns, let's take a moment to acknowledge another crucial element of the war: the role of African Americans. The documentary mentioned their contributions to the Union war effort, but I'd love to hear more about their experiences and impact.
It's a vital part of the story. Remember the Emancipation Proclamation we discussed earlier?
The one that declared slaves in Confederate states to be free.
That's the one. It didn't just shift the moral ground of the war, it also opened the door for African Americans to officially join the Union Army.
So they were finally able to fight for their own freedom.
Yes, and they did so with incredible courage and determination. Over 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army and Navy, playing a significant role in the Union's eventual victory.
That's a remarkable testament to their resilience and commitment to the cause of freedom. Can you share an example of a particularly notable African American unit?
One that stands out is the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first all-black regiments in the Union Army.
I've heard of them. Weren't they involved in the assault on Fort Wagner?
They were. It was a fierce battle, and the 54th fought bravely, suffering heavy losses. Their courage and sacrifice helped to change public opinion about the capabilities of black soldiers.
Their story is truly inspiring. It's a reminder that the fight for equality was fought on many fronts, not just by politicians and generals, but by ordinary people who risked their lives for a better future.
Exactly. And their contributions to the Union war effort were essential to the ultimate victory.
And with that in mind, let's delve into the final campaigns that ultimately led to the Confederacy's defeat. What happened after the Union secured those crucial victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg? Where did the conflict shift next?
Well, in the East, the focus shifted to Virginia, where General Ulysses S. Grant took command of the Union Army.
Grant. He was a tough one, wasn't he?
He was, and he had a reputation for being relentless. He faced off against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and Grant's strategy was one of attrition.
Attrition, what does that mean?
It means wearing down the enemy by constantly attacking, constantly pressuring them, using the Union's superior resources to grind them down.
So a war of attrition, a relentless grind to deplete the enemy's strength.
Exactly. And it was a brutal strategy, but it was effective. The Overland Campaign of 1864 was a series of bloody battles in Virginia that exemplified this approach. It started with the Battle of the Wilderness in May.
The wilderness, what was that like?
Imagine fighting in dense woods. Visibility was limited, and the fighting was often hand-to-hand. It was a horrifying battle, with heavy casualties on both sides.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was. And after the Wilderness came Spotsylvania Courthouse, another bloody stalemate. And then one of the most horrific battles of the war, Cold Harbor.
Cold Harbor, I've heard that name, but I don't know much about it.
It was a disastrous frontal assault by Union forces against entrenched Confederate positions. Over 7,000 Union casualties in a single day.
Oh my God.
Even Grant later expressed regret for that attack. It was a terrible loss of life.
But despite these setbacks, Grant kept pushing forward.
He did. He refused to retreat. Instead, he kept moving south, constantly pressuring Lee's army. And eventually, this led to the Siege of Petersburg.
Petersburg. Why was that city so important?
It was a vital supply hub for the Confederate capital, Richmond. Capturing Petersburg would essentially cut off Richmond from the rest of the Confederacy.
So, by laying siege to Petersburg, Grant was putting a stranglehold on the very heart of the Confederacy.
Exactly. The siege lasted for 9 months, a brutal stalemate that slowly drained the Confederacy's already dwindling resources.
It sounds like a war of attrition on a massive scale, a slow and agonizing grind that ultimately broke the back of the Confederacy.
That's a very accurate description. And while the siege dragged on, the war wasn't confined to Virginia. The documentary also mentioned General William Sherman's campaign in the West.
Ah, yes, Sherman. He was a controversial figure, wasn't he?
He was. His campaign was bold and destructive. He led his army on a march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, cutting a swath of destruction through the heart of the Confederacy.
This is the infamous Sherman's March to the Sea, right?
The one and only. Sherman's tactics were brutal. He destroyed railroads, burned crops, and seized supplies.
It sounds like a scorched earth policy, a deliberate strategy to break the South's will to fight.
It was, and it was effective. Sherman's March to the Sea deeply demoralized the Confederacy, demonstrating the futility of continued resistance.
So, while Grant tightened the noose around Petersburg, Sherman was wreaking havoc in the heart of the Confederacy, a coordinated effort to break the South on multiple fronts.
Exactly. These campaigns, coupled with other Union victories in the West, spelled doom for the Confederacy. Their resources were depleted, their armies shattered, their hopes of victory fading fast.
It sounds like the end was inevitable. But before we get to the final surrender, I'm struck by this image of two very different approaches to victory. Grant's relentless grind in the East and Sherman's destructive march through the South.
It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? Both strategies were effective in their own way, but they also highlight the complex moral dilemmas of war.
It raises difficult questions about the ethics of war, about the balance between achieving military objectives and the human cost of those actions.
Questions that we continue to grapple with today. The Civil War, with its complex strategies and devastating consequences, forces us to confront these difficult truths about the nature of conflict.
Indeed. It's a reminder that victory often comes at a high price, and that even in the pursuit of a just cause, difficult choices must be made.
And those choices have ramifications that extend far beyond the battlefield, shaping the lives of individuals, communities, and entire nations for generations to come.
Well, with the Confederacy on the verge of collapse and the human cost of war weighing heavy on our minds, we're ready to explore the final chapter of this epic story. What were the key events that led to the Confederacy's surrender and the end of the Civil War?
Those final months were a whirlwind of events, a dramatic culmination of years of sacrifice and struggle. But to fully grasp the weight of those events, we need to step back and examine the strategic situation as 1864 drew to a close.
All right, let's set the stage. What was the state of the Confederacy as the war entered its final year?
By the end of 1864, the Confederacy was on its last legs. Their armies were decimated, their resources dwindled, and their morale was plummeting. Grant's relentless pressure in Virginia, combined with Sherman's destructive sweep through the South, had taken a devastating toll.
It sounds like they were teetering on the brink of collapse. Was there any hope left for the Confederacy, or was defeat inevitable at this point?
Well, hope is a powerful thing, and they weren't ready to give up just yet.
So they still had some fight left in them. What were they hoping for at this point? Some kind of miracle?
Maybe, or perhaps they were hoping that war weariness in the North would lead to a negotiated peace, a settlement that would allow them to maintain some degree of autonomy.
But the Union wasn't exactly known for its willingness to compromise at this point, especially after so much bloodshed.
True, and the strategic situation was pretty dire for the Confederacy. Their economy was in shambles thanks to the Union blockade. Supplies were running low, manpower was dwindling.
So even though they weren't quite ready to throw in the towel, the odds were stacked against them. What were some of those key events that sealed their fate in those final months?
One major blow came in January 1865 when Fort Fisher in North Carolina fell to the Union.
Fort Fisher. That name rings a bell. What was its strategic significance?
It was the last major Confederate port on the Atlantic. Losing it was a huge blow to their ability to import supplies and export cotton.
So it tightened the Union blockade even further, essentially strangling the Confederacy's economy.
Exactly. And then, in April of 1865, Grant finally broke through the Confederate lines at Petersburg.
After 9 long months of siege warfare.
Yep. It was a brutal and costly victory, but it forced Lee to abandon both Petersburg and Richmond.
The fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital. That must have been a devastating blow, both strategically and symbolically.
It was. Imagine the impact on Confederate morale. Their capital city, the symbol of their cause, now in Union hands. It was pretty clear that the war was lost. Lee's army was in full retreat, trying to escape westward, with Grant hot on their heels.
So, with their capital fallen, their main army on the run, the Confederacy's days are numbered. What happened next in this final act?
Lee was trying to reach other Confederate armies further west, hoping to regroup and maybe prolong the fight, but Grant was relentless in his pursuit. He wasn't going to let Lee escape.
A true bulldog, that Grant.
You could say that. And on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Lee's army was surrounded and forced to surrender.
Appomattox. The name itself evokes such a sense of finality, an end of an era.
It was a momentous occasion. The terms of surrender, dictated by Grant, were surprisingly generous, reflecting Lincoln's desire to reunite the nation as quickly and peacefully as possible.
It's remarkable how Lincoln, even in victory, was already looking ahead to the challenges of reconciliation and healing. Sadly, he wouldn't live to see those efforts through.
Yeah, just days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer.
A tragic twist of fate, and such a tremendous loss for the nation.
It was. Lincoln's death cast a long shadow over the process of reunification, and it left the nation reeling just as it was starting to grapple with the challenges of rebuilding and reconciliation.
And his successor, Andrew Johnson, would face the daunting task of leading the nation through this turbulent period. But before we delve into the complexities of Reconstruction, I think it's important to understand the immediate impact of the war's end. What happened to the millions of newly freed slaves? What were their lives like in this new reality?
It's a question that's often overlooked. The end of slavery was a monumental achievement, but it was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward equality for African Americans.
Freedom, while a monumental victory, was just the starting point of a whole new struggle.
Precisely, and that struggle was fraught with challenges. Many former slaves, having known nothing but a life of forced labor, were ill-equipped to navigate this new world.
What were some of the biggest challenges they faced?
Well, for starters, many lacked basic necessities, things like education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, things that most people take for granted. They were often left to fend for themselves in a society still deeply divided along racial lines.
So even though slavery was abolished, the legacy of racism and inequality persisted.
Oh, absolutely. The South was still deeply resistant to change. And the federal government, despite its best efforts, struggled to enforce the newly won rights of African Americans.
It sounds like freedom, while a cause for celebration, was just the first step in a much longer, more complex journey, a journey that continues to this day.
It does. And that's something we need to remember as we explore the period of Reconstruction, the attempt to rebuild the South and reintegrate it into the Union, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America.
Reconstruction, a period often shrouded in myths and misconceptions. What were some of the key goals and challenges of this pivotal era?
The overarching goal was to rebuild the South and reintegrate it into the Union. But that involved a whole host of complex issues: rebuilding infrastructure, establishing new governments, ensuring the rights of newly freed slaves.
It was like trying to piece together a shattered vase, a monumental task.
It was, and there were fierce debates about how best to go about it, different visions of what Reconstruction should look like.
Competing visions. Who were the main players in this debate?
Well, you had President Andrew Johnson, who had taken over after Lincoln's assassination. He favored a relatively lenient approach towards the former Confederate states.
Lenient. In what way?
He believed in forgiveness and a quick return to normalcy. He didn't want to punish the South too harshly. He thought it was important to move on and let the South manage its own affairs with minimal interference from the federal government.
So a more hands-off approach. But wasn't everyone on board with that?
Not exactly. A powerful faction in Congress, known as the Radical Republicans, strongly opposed Johnson's approach.
The Radical Republicans. They sound like a formidable group. What was their vision for Reconstruction?
They believed that Johnson was being far too lenient. They argued that the South needed to be held accountable for the injustices of slavery, and they wanted strong federal intervention to protect the rights of African Americans. They weren't interested in sweeping things under the rug.
So a clash of ideologies. A continuation of the political and social divisions that had fueled the war itself.
You got it. And these divisions played out on the national stage as Johnson and the Radical Republicans battled for control over the direction of Reconstruction.
A political tug of war, with the fate of millions of newly freed African Americans hanging in the balance. What was the outcome of this struggle? Who ultimately prevailed?
Well, in the short term, the Radical Republicans gained the upper hand. They were able to override many of Johnson's vetoes and pass some significant legislation.
What kind of legislation?
Landmark legislation like the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution.
Those were huge steps forward, weren't they?
They were. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves. And the 15th Amendment prohibited states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
So these amendments essentially enshrine the principles of equality and voting rights into the Constitution. A major victory for the cause of racial justice.
On paper, yes, but the reality on the ground was much more complicated. Enacting laws is one thing. Enforcing them is another thing altogether, especially in a society as deeply resistant to change as the South was at that time.
So while these amendments were a significant victory in principle, the fight for true equality was far from over.
Exactly. African Americans continued to face tremendous obstacles in exercising their newly won rights, especially in the South.
What were some of the ways in which the South resisted these efforts to advance racial equality?
One of the most insidious and effective tactics was the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
The KKK, a dark chapter in American history.
They used violence, intimidation, and terror to suppress black voting rights and maintain white supremacy. They were a constant threat to African Americans and their allies.
It's heartbreaking to think that even after the abolition of slavery, African Americans faced such violence and oppression. Did these acts of terror have a significant impact on the progress of Reconstruction?
They absolutely did. This climate of fear and violence made it incredibly difficult for African Americans to exercise their rights, particularly the right to vote. It also undermined the federal government's efforts to enforce Reconstruction policies and protect the newly freed population.
So, despite the best intentions and the passage of landmark legislation, Reconstruction faced some serious challenges in implementation. Did it ultimately succeed in its goals of rebuilding the South and achieving racial equality?
That's a complex question. Reconstruction was a mixed bag, you could say. It did achieve some notable successes. The southern states were readmitted to the Union, new state governments were established, and there were some gains in education and economic opportunities for African Americans.
So there were some positive developments, some steps in the right direction, but it sounds like these gains were fragile and ultimately unsustainable.
They were. Reconstruction was a period of both progress and backlash. And ultimately, it was undermined by a combination of factors: political maneuvering at the national level, economic challenges in the South, and the persistent racism and violence that plagued the region. It was a noble experiment that ultimately fell short of its lofty goals.
Was there a specific turning point that marked the decline of Reconstruction and the resurgence of white supremacy in the South?
You could point to the Compromise of 1877 as a pivotal moment.
The Compromise of 1877, what was that about?
It was a political deal struck in the aftermath of a disputed presidential election. Essentially, it traded the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in exchange for the presidency for Rutherford B. Hayes.
So a political compromise that sacrificed the safety and protection of African Americans in the South for political expediency.
Essentially, yes. And the consequences were devastating for African Americans. With federal troops gone, white Southerners were emboldened to regain control and roll back many of the gains made during Reconstruction.
So Reconstruction ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a betrayal of the very people it was meant to protect.
It's a tragic chapter in American history, and it had long-lasting consequences. The South quickly moved to enact Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation and disenfranchisement.
Jim Crow, a system of racial apartheid that would plague the South for nearly a century.
Exactly. The legacy of Reconstruction is a complex one, a mix of hope and disappointment. It showed that progress is possible, but it also demonstrated just how deeply ingrained racism was in American society, and how fragile progress can be, especially when political will falters.
A sobering lesson, for sure. And a reminder that the fight for justice and equality is a continuous process, requiring constant vigilance and unwavering commitment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Civil War and Reconstruction might be historical events, but their echoes resonate through time, shaping our understanding of who we are as a nation, and the challenges we still face in creating a more just and equitable society for all.
And as we delve deeper into the aftermath of the Civil War and its lasting legacy, we're confronted not only with historical facts, but with the enduring questions that continue to challenge us today. Questions about race, equality, justice, and the true meaning of freedom in a society still grappling with the ghosts of its past.
And those questions are precisely what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll examine the long-term impact of the Civil War, how it influenced American culture, politics, and society, and what lessons we can learn from this pivotal chapter in our nation's history.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. We've covered a lot of ground already.
From the causes to the key battles, the turning points, and the immediate aftermath.
And now we're shifting our focus to the long-term impact of this conflict on American society.
It's amazing to think how a war fought over 150 years ago still shapes our culture, our politics, our very identity as a nation.
It's like we've been piecing together a puzzle, and now we're finally stepping back to see the whole picture.
Exactly. And one of the most prominent pieces of that picture is the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, officially ended this horrific institution in the United States.
A monumental shift, no doubt. It's hard to imagine the U.S. today without acknowledging that fundamental change. But as we discussed earlier, legal freedom was only the first step in a much longer journey toward true equality for African Americans.
Absolutely. The struggle for civil rights, for equal opportunities in education, housing, employment, and voting continued long after the war ended.
So Reconstruction, while ultimately falling short of its goals, laid the groundwork for those later movements.
You could say that the Civil War planted a seed, and while it took generations for that seed to fully blossom, it contained the potential for a more just and equitable society.
That's a powerful image. And that ongoing struggle for equality, fueled by the resilience and determination of African Americans, is a direct consequence of that pivotal period.
The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, the fight for voting rights, even the movements for social justice we see today, they all have roots in the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction.
It's a reminder that history is not just something that happened in the past. It shapes our present and influences our future.
And the Civil War's impact goes beyond just the issue of race and equality. It also had a profound effect on the balance of power between the federal government and individual states.
Ah, yes. States' rights versus federal authority. That's a tension that's been woven into the fabric of American politics since the very beginning.
And the Civil War brought that tension to a head.
How so?
The war definitively settled the question of whether states could secede from the Union. The Union victory established the supremacy of the federal government and its authority over individual states.
So it drew a line in the sand. The Union is indivisible, and the federal government has the final say.
Yes, but that line has been blurred and contested throughout our history. Think about issues like healthcare, education, environmental regulations, even gun control. The debate over federal versus state power continues to this day.
But the Civil War set a precedent, established a principle that still shapes our political landscape.
Exactly. And beyond the political and social spheres, the Civil War also left an indelible mark on American culture. It's a subject that continues to captivate our imaginations.
You see it everywhere. Books, movies, songs, Even video games exploring the Civil War. It's a subject that we keep revisiting, re-examining, trying to make sense of.
It speaks to the enduring power of this historical event. The stories of courage, sacrifice, tragedy, and resilience resonate across generations, inspiring artists and storytellers to grapple with its complex legacy.
It's like we're still collectively trying to understand its meaning, its implications for who we are as Americans.
Precisely. The Civil War is a story that we keep telling and retelling, each generation finding new layers of meaning and relevance in its themes.
And as we do so, we're not just confronting historical facts. We're also examining our own values and beliefs about what it means to be American.
It's a reminder that history is not just something that happened in the past. It's alive within us, shaping our present and influencing our future.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of awe at the complexity and the enduring power of the Civil War.
It was a truly pivotal event that reshaped a nation, and its echoes are still felt today, in ways both big and small.
It's been an incredible journey exploring this chapter of American history. From those early tensions that led to the conflict to the battles that raged across the land and the long-lasting legacy that continues to shape us.
And as you continue to learn about the Civil War, I encourage you to go beyond the dates and the names. Delve into those human stories, the personal sacrifices, the challenges overcome, and the lessons we can draw from this pivotal chapter.
Because history is not just a collection of facts. It's a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience, a story that continues to unfold.
And may we always strive to learn from the past, to build a future where those ideals of freedom, equality, and justice, so fiercely fought for during that tumultuous era, are truly realized for all.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the American Civil War. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.